arc in the same image here. So that it could be the most 90s thing.
Great question,
ever.
More to Steal. Question for the uneducated. Please explain the terms Gold and Silver Age in relation to comics.
So, the history of comics is separated into ages.
It's about time and eras.
Yeah. It's basically like terms like the Renaissance.
Yeah.
This is how the language we use. The Golden Age is the birth of American comics. Tintin had been around for like a dozen years already. But the Golden Age officially starts in 1938 when Superman first premieres in Action Comics #1. Before Action Comics, there was the comic books that you could buy in newsstands were just reprints of Sunday morning cartoon strips that were in the funny papers. And then not until National Allied Publications was like, hey, what if we made one of these just its own book and it didn't come from the newspapers? And so they did Action Comics #1, which had Superman and like Zatara and Hawkman and some other people in it. So that begins the Golden Age, which is basically just the World War II comics. This is where Captain America comes from, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. There was a Green Lantern, Alan Scott, he was magical. There was a Flash, Jay Garrick, he had a saucepan on his head. There was a Human Torch, he was a robot. So there were some characters that are familiar, but different versions of them. And then, basically after World War II, comics died. The superhero comics died. The comics that are popular after World War II are romance comics. And mystery comics mostly. The only characters that made it through the post-war era were Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Those are the only ones. And Captain America, basically the minute the war ended, there were no Captain America comics. Nobody gave a shit about Captain America anymore. So then the Silver Age begins. We attribute it to the 60s.
Sorry. Flash had Mercury's helmet on his head.
He did have Mercury's helmet on his head, and it looks very much like a plate upside down. Namor was also Golden Age, yes. That's why they say Namor is the first mutant, because really, narratively, it's Ensaban Nur, of course, Apocalypse, but the first ever mutant in comics was, Namor before the X-Men. So the Silver Age is the second era. It technically begins in 1954 when The Flash is rebooted, the first reboot of comic books. National Allied Publications, who later rebrand as DC, had these characters like Green Lantern and The Flash that made the money once, but nobody remembered anymore. So a guy named Julie Schwartz revamped them with sci-fi origins. Green Lantern was a space cop, and Flash had the same origin except for he had a space. He basically just had a new costume that was way more 60s spacesuit. And so the 60s bring about the Silver Age, also known as the Marvel Age of Comics. Because this is when Stan Lee had been writing since the Golden Age, he was going to quit comics. He was like, I'm done with this. I chose this Stan Lee pen name because someday I wanted to write real books. Nobody's listening to me. And his wife was like, how about before you quit? And Stan Lee always makes sure that he credits his wife. Every time he tells this story, he's always like, my wife told me to do this. He never takes credit for the idea, which is super sweet to me.
Or she's just bugging him.
Or she's like, don't take credit for my idea, like 50 years later. Yeah. She was like, how about before you quit, you just write a book that you like. You just give them something and see what they think. And so he wanted to write a book that was less, bland, or basically it wasn't as fun to be a superhero. Because that was his idea, so he created the Fantastic Four.
Get on Nerd Society, that's so cool. This show got you into comic books.
Oh,
that's awesome.
I'm so happy to hear that. That's my life goal, is to get people into comic books. So
you've already achieved it.
Yes, thank you.
Well, where are you going from here?
The next person. More people. More comic books. So Stan Lee creates the Fantastic Four, which is a huge hit, and then Stan Lee becomes the guy for Marvel. So the 60s are the Marvel Age, the Silver Age of comics. And this is where, the Teen Titans form. This is where the multiverse is born in DC. A lot of really silly things in the Silver Age. And this is also the lowest point for Batman. Batman never came closer to failing than he did in the 60s, which is why they were like, well, since Batman's a joke, let's make him a joke. And we got Adam West, the Batman TV show. Then in 70s, something interesting happens. A bunch of creators like Neil Adams and Roy Thomas grew up reading comics and now wanted to write comics, which wasn't the case in the Silver Age. When the Silver Age started, the people who read Golden Age comics were soldiers or like children, so they weren't as interested in writing comics. So in kind of the mid-70s, late 60s, the Bronze Age begins as a new generation of comics creators that grew up with comics wants to write comics. And this is when comics begin to really grow up and get serious. This is where we get our super liberal Green Arrow that sort of takes Hal Jordan to task in Green Arrow, Green Lantern. This is where the Legion of Superheroes really come into their own. 1975, giant-sized X-Men #1 comes out with Wolverine and Storm and Colossus and Banshee and the whole new thing. And so 70s is the beginning of comics growing up. This is where we got Ra's al Ghul, right? Because Neil Adams was like, Batman's nemesis shouldn't be a clown.
Right.
Should be the League of Assassins.
Obvious.
And now we have both. Because you don't just get rid of the
Why
Joker.
not both?
Yeah. And so that's the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age kind of officially ends in 1985, when things like Crisis on Infinite Earths and Watchmen happen. And at that point, we don't really have clear names. We've got like, it's called the Tin Age or the Dark Age. And sometimes it's from 1985 to today. Some people think in the mid-2000s it switched to the digital age. But kind of from the 80s to today, we're in kind of one nebulous era, where the 90s just kind of sticks out as its own part of that influence.
It kind of feels that way with everything, though, because that's when, like, really globalization hit, and, like...
Yeah. And that's definitely a big part
literally
of it.
every industry in the world.
Yeah, like, nothing didn't go through a grunge phase. Yeah, Grim Dark Age, the Grunge Age, you can call it whatever you want. Yeah, okay. So that's what we mean when we say the different eras. Golden Age, World War II, Silver Age, 60s, Bronze Age, 70s and 80s, and then everything else is kind of the modern age.
And the more you know.